There it goes. Hello. Thank you for all for coming out today. Sorry DeFar couldn't be here today, but I'll be representing him to give you this talk today. Before I get into his talk, I want to kind of go over briefly kind of the importance of what the emissions kind of can do and what we can get from satellites using ground-based instruments as well, which is other work that we're doing with our group and synonymous with the Discover AQ mission, as well as Seekers and Seek Ions, which is an intensive ozone sonde network study that we've done with 7 different sites across the southeast United States. And from where we see kind of synoptic features in the meteorology that kind of show you pretty much that we can see same features at multiple sites across the United States. And so you can see that at Boulder, Colorado, all the way down to Tallahassee, Florida, we can see similar features in ozone structure in the middle layers of the troposphere. And then similar things that you can see kind of widespread and sometimes not widespread is stratospheric intrusions, which is a session that was covered earlier. And then this is shown on my poster work as well. So you can see at St. Louis that you see a strong folding of the tropopause that was captured by the sonde. And you also see mixing of biomass burning plume at the lower levels. And this is kind of an interesting case that it's rarely seen to where you have mixing of the plume with wildfires as well as stratospheric intrusions. So to get into the talk of today, which is power plant of NOx emissions estimated by OMI, we first looked into this case and we realized that OMI data can be kind of messy sometimes. So we had to kind of generate a synthetic case, so to speak. So we generated our own data using the CAMX model. And with this model, we have the exact emissions, we have the exact lifetimes that we input into the model, so we can tell exactly where our methods of estimations can break down and what is the limitations of what we can accurately say with those methods. So from a recent paper that we published in Atmospheric Environment earlier this year was we found that basically in terms of the plume speed and plume direction, that you can get pretty good estimates with the box model, which really doesn't care where the plume speed and direction is, so it pretty much cares about what goes in it and what goes out, as well as the Gaussian fit. It doesn't matter which direction the plume is being spread, because it depends on the wind speed, the plume can go in a different direction. So what we found is that once you do this method, which is found in several papers by Filatov and Bailey and others, is that you rotate the plume as if the wind is blowing from the same direction on every given day, and then from there you can kind of do this fitting of a curve, so to speak, and you can derive the emissions as well as the lifetimes and other parameters in terms of what's actually coming from the point sources. So from our point sources that we generated, we can kind of determine the limitations, and what we found is that our estimations are kind of they generate relatively short lifetimes for NOx and other SO2 and other things of that nature, and we can kind of realize that we need to do some more tests to kind of see if we can get a better method from this. But what we can do is we can generate proper emissions, and we can get pretty well agreement with what the emissions actually were from these methods, though. So it's good for emissions, bad for lifetime, so to speak. And then, so what we want to do further now is, with this work, is we want to look into, can we do this for the real cases now using OMI? So we looked at the continuous emissions monitoring sites. So it's kind of basically like a monitor put into all the power plants, all the large plant sources, and then a study done by Brian Duncan and others. He pretty much looks at 50 different power plants or so, more than that, across the United States, and he kind of tried to tie those emissions to what the satellite was seeing. And he expected better correlation, but we found pretty weak correlation between the two. But we found that there is a relationship between what the emissions is at the actual power plant to what OMI does see. So we want to kind of see, can we get the better fit for those? So once again, we were going to use we originally was going to use all of them, but we realized that this method also breaks down once you get interference from other power plant sources or large plume sources. So we couldn't use power plants that are close to other cities, and we could not use power plants that are close to other power plants. So we chose 29 out of those found in his study that were relatively 100 kilometers away from any other interfering source, so we can kind of better test our method and better get the sensitivities of our method. So once we rotate all the plumes properly to the eastward direction, we used a product by Berkeley, California, which, and what we want to do with OMI, since the data also has a lot of row anomalies and a lot of issues with the retrievals, we just wanted to use the rows that were consistent from 2005 to 2011, all the data that was available, so it's consistent throughout each year, and we don't really have interference to where it's biased towards one year or the other. And then we oversampled that down even further to a 4-kilometer grid so we can get higher resolution. And then we use data from 2005 to 2011. And then also what we noticed with this method is that it's highly dependent on the wind speeds and how good of your quality of wind measurements is. And we use the ERA interim because we found out that it's a little bit better than NAR, which is North American Reanalysis INCEP winds. So with that being said, we found out that we found a pretty good emissions is what I mentioned earlier. We have a pretty good curve with the minus of a few outliers, which is what we're still looking into at this current time. But we found out that it does give us a good estimate for emissions. However, as I said earlier, the lifetimes are really short. As you can see, the general average is about 2. As you can get some up to 4 and 4.5 for NOx. And we know for NOx, a lifetime of a couple hours is relatively unrealistic. So we're going to look into that further. And then when it comes to using the emissions, we wanted to try to figure out, okay, so if we can't figure it out in the short term, maybe if we average more data into it, we can figure out in the long term if we can figure out a general trend for these sites. So we started to average maybe seasonally, and then we averaged for yearly. So this is the fit for averaging each year. So 2005 to 2007, 2006, and stuff of those nature. So as you see, once you start to average over a long period of time, you get a better fit for the lifetimes as well as emissions. So we can get a general trend in the decrease as well as the increase or at certain sites as opposed to the day-to-days or the week-to-weeks as opposed to those trends. And now one thing that we realized is that we can use a kind of a statistically box plot. So a very simple model. And what we can do with this model is we can input those lifetimes that we derived, and we can kind of see what would be the perfect lifetimes to get based off the emissions that we get from the power plants. So we can tell if our lifetimes and emissions are accurate based off this, because once we input the lifetimes, we can tell if the emissions are correct. And our emissions for the box plots were pretty accurate based off our 2-hour lifetime that we input, even though for most cases it was slightly off, but we knew how much it was off based off how much we put into it. So, and we also used the same rotation for this method as well. Sorry. So for our box model estimates, I would like to show that it shows pretty good agreement with the actual CEMS emissions. So this gave us a lot of kind of a happy cheer that our box plot was kind of a good fit, and our box plot kind of shows good emissions. So once we realized that all we need to do is derive the proper lifetimes, and then we can use the box model plot to kind of derive these emissions and try to use those to kind of tell the emergency planners and all these guys that whether it's decreasing or increasing for certain power plant point sources. So not only can we now identify those sources, but we can tell their emissions and lifetimes as well. With some. So we want to kind of test further whether this is a good fit for depending on seasonally, or if it's a good fit depending on how far we can get down as opposed to using yearly data. If we can get down to 2 months or 1 month. And what we found is that, as you can see in these plots, once you do the yearly averages, it's pretty good fit. And then once you switch to 2 months, so it kind of breaks down in the methods. So one thing we wanted to do, we tested seasonally, so we tested summer, we tested winter, so we pretty much split into 3 months averages, and we realized that you can't really get statistically significant figures from doing such short averages of OMI data. So we realized that we pretty much have to use 6 months at least in order to get a statistically significant number. So in conclusion, we like to say it's kind of a glass half full, glass half empty type problem, to where it's half full in the sense of the lifetimes were not really representative of the chemistry, but we can represent the dispersion lifetime, and we can represent the lifetime of how long it's inside of our box plot or how long it's dispersed away from the plume. But we can't get the full lifetime of the chemical models themselves. And as well as we can't get the accuracy and reliability down to 2 months or a real seasonal trend, but we can get it over the trend of the ozone period. So from May to August, for example, we can get a pretty good trend of what the emissions would be and what the lifetime would be. And then also, the glass is half full in terms of our EMG was found to be very reliable in terms of its emissions for the yearly time period. And then also the box model gives pretty much accurate results and robust measurements for the 6-month time period. So thank you.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of questions. We have time for a lot of questions.
Went a little quick, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned you took the surface wind speed as the wind speed to base your calculations on. Wouldn't it be better to take a mean boundary layer wind speed? And that's where most of the NO2 is, and the winds are higher, in the middle of the boundary layer than the surface.
So I've tested this with NAR as well, and we can get from 0 to 500 meters, and that's as high as we've gone in terms of the wind speed. So, but with that, I mean, it really doesn't increase the accuracy of this method necessarily. Yeah, it could change the results. Yeah, the wind speeds do change the results, but not that significant in terms of how much you can get for the emissions, but it changes the lifetime significantly. So that's why we're not really 100% confident on the lifetimes that we can derive from this method, but the emissions is pretty good. So.